Yo, buddy. How's it
What's up,
going?
Steve? Good,
Welcome
man.
to another episode of Global Tantrum. Happy Valentine's Day.
Hey, you too. Probably
Yeah,
means a lot more in your household than it does in mine.
not necessarily. My children are demanding Valentine's gifts, which were not a thing when I was growing up, but apparently are now.
That wasn't a
They're
thing for me either, man.
they're tiny, adorable brigands, my children. And as part of Valentine's Day, we're going to talk about probably the least romantic thing I can think of, which is the denouement of the war in Ukraine.
Let's go. Hey,
Okay.
until you just said it, I didn't really realize that today was Valentine's Day. So
I know. I'm required to think about it.
that makes one of us.
You know how it is. Yeah. Quick aside, St. Valentine's. Do you know any history about him?
This might be one where if I said I used to, I'd be lying. I'm not sure I've ever inquired into anything about that guy.
It doesn't matter. All right, let's move on. Um,
All right, good talk.
yeah. Okay. We're not talking about Gaza this week. Thank goodness. There would be more to say there, but we promised not to talk about it for another month. And last week we said we were hoping to get some information about the Trump administration's views towards the Ukraine war, and in particular, whether or not it would be ending soon, potentially. So, what's the latest on Trump administration's policies towards Ukraine?
Yeah, so on on the Trump side, not a totally consistent message,
Mm,
although some of it might just be for bargaining purposes. But the strongest language I saw came from newly confirmed Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth,
great hair,
who
amazing hair.
some controversial tattoos, as I understand as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't
Uh,
necessarily smell his breath, but
I don't think you got to. But he said a few notable things. He and Trump both insinuated fairly explicitly that NATO membership was off the table as one of the terms of a settlement. So that
right.
obviously had been potentially condition number one that we were
Hmm.
looking at. The other piece was returning to the 2014 lines and keeping in mind there's a few different parts of this. There's Crimea,
Hmm.
there's the territory that the Russians seized as part of kind of that frozen conflict that broke out in 2014. And then there's the territorial changes since the full fledged invasion 3 years ago this month.
Right.
So that's ambiguous to say it won't be the 2014 lines. It suggests that Russia is going to keep at least some of the territory it has occupied. And the third piece, coming from Hegseth in particular, was a more general comment of the US has bigger fish to fry in strategic terms. And so the security and defense of Europe is not going to rate as highly as it has in US foreign policy in the past. So those are all pretty big statements. On the other hand, the vice president, Vance, that guy,
That guy, another beardo.
yeah, yeah, I like that. Basically said that if the Russians aren't going to play ball, the US did have all sorts of leverage and mechanisms it can use to try to inflict greater pain on Vladimir Putin, whether those are economic sanctions, other financial instruments, or military pressure. So that might be a bad cop to Trump's good cop, but those were what I saw as the key things that have been reported so far.
All right. So we've got two talking head court jester type figures in this administration. Ordinarily, the Secretary of Defense and the Vice President's comments would carry a lot of water. What does the big guy have to say? Because in this administration, it's all about what the big guy wants. And he made some remarks as well about Ukraine, didn't he?
Yeah, again, he did say that NATO was probably off the table.
Uh-huh.
And the sense I've gotten is he just wants to get this done.
He wants a
And
deal. While campaigning, he said, I would fix this in 24 hours. Then he has seen that's unlikely to happen. In fact, 24 hours have elapsed. May not even happen in his first 100 days. Sorry, Donnie. But I would agree with you. And he doesn't seem particularly sympathetic towards the Ukrainians. He has said maybe someday they'll be Russians. Like he explicitly said that. Maybe not. Who knows? He has also alluded to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky's increasingly precarious political situation, saying his public approval ratings don't look so good.
Yeah, and
And
Steve, he's not a big fan of Zelensky.
he's not a big fan. Why is he not a big fan? Because somewhat infamously, you might remember during his first impeachment in 2019, it was kicked off by Donnie basically leaning on Zelensky for information about Joe Biden. And I don't remember the exact details, but it was like some mob boss type shit being like,
That's when all the Mueller report stuff got going. Yeah, that was the heart of the first impeachment trial.
that's right, 2019. And man, if that impeachment had gone through, things would be different. Anyway, doesn't matter. Didn't happen. We're on the bad timeline and so on. Some people would disagree with that. That's fine. Everybody's saying it. Yeah. So I guess I have two questions for you. One question, is this basically what you expected from the Trump administration? Number one. And number two, how much does this represent a departure from previous American policy in Ukraine and towards the defense of Europe?
The first question is the easier one, which is, yeah, more or less. Now, Vance's comments complicate things a bit, but my sense, as you just pointed out, is Trump wants to cut a deal. I don't think he cares all that much about the fate of Ukraine, the precise details of the settlement. I think it will look something like Russia annexes the territory it currently occupies.
Mm-hmm. So frozen battle lines, frozen conflict.
Yeah, I don't really see a way. Sure, maybe Vance's comments can be interpreted as trying to put some bargaining pressure on the Russians to sweeten the pill a little bit. But I don't see the United States putting boots on the ground. That's certainly what Hegseth indicated.
Was there ever any prospect of that, though?
Not as far as I know.
I don't think Biden suggested we would ever do that.
Yeah, and Trump, now there were instances there were concerns about the war expanding to other NATO territories, and that could put the United States in a bit of a bind. Although, as we might get to, Article 5 of the NATO Charter is not as ironclad as one might think if you actually examine the history behind it carefully. So,
or the wording. Yeah, there's some loopholes in there, right?
I don't think the idea of the United States fighting a war over Ukraine it makes any sense in domestic political terms, let alone in strategic terms. So the leverage the U.S. has is limited because I don't think Trump wants to keep resourcing this war. I just checked since the war began 3 years ago, the total U.S. aid to Ukraine is about $175 billion.
Let's put that in perspective. How does that compare, for instance, to aid to Israel?
So if you just look at the aid that goes directly to Ukraine, in other words, not money that's allocated for spending on weapons in U.S. factories, which then get shipped to Ukraine or to replenish Pentagon stocks. So just money that's directly going to Ukraine. That number is like $105 billion, which is roughly tenfold what the United States has given Israel during that same period. Israel traditionally being the single largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid. So a lot of money.
So this is not nothing. And if I'm recalling correctly, the U.S. total defense budget order of magnitude is somewhere around $800 billion a year, something like that.
I'd have to check the most, but yes, that sounds ballpark correct.
And we're talking about over a 3-year period, $100 billion, $50 million. It's sizable.
Now, like as per capita GDP goes, there are some European countries that are ahead of the US, but unfortunately, Estonia's economy just isn't very big. So sure,
they have quite a bit more at stake, though.
That's correct, which is why I think they're contributor number one in terms of per capita contributions.
Poland's up there too.
Yeah,
these are countries, to be clear, that did not used to exist during the Cold War. So, Poland did nominally,
but Ukraine did not either. Ukraine was also part of the Soviet Union, as were the Baltic states, and we could list a few others. So that's in response to your first question. No, I'm not that surprised. I
think you called this maybe during our first show like a month ago. We touched on this a little bit, And you were
My
not expecting
my
much.
memory is not what it used to be, Steve.
Yeah,
So
mine either. And I was like a little bit more circumspect. I was like, we actually have some leverage here. Trump doesn't like to just give away the game for no reason, but it seems that's what he's doing. And he
yeah,
just wants to get it done. And I think that's an accurate assessment. We'll see what actually comes out of this.
yeah, and then
Okay.
when you actually get down to the negotiations, which we'll talk about, it will be more complex. Anytime you have triangular diplomacy, or in this case, if you want to count the other European powers besides Ukraine as a fourth party, things get very complicated. If you look at the end of the Vietnam War, when the United States had to negotiate not just with the North Vietnamese, but its ally, the South Vietnamese, the
Mhm.
negotiations always get complicated. And Trump did say that the Ukrainians would have a seat at the table.
Yeah, but
So,
where? Is it at the kiddie
right,
table? Yeah. And,
fair
and and
enough.
to your point though, this is a question I asked when we were chatting about this episode. Do the Ukrainians necessarily have to stop fighting? This would be a deal between the United States and Russia. The Ukrainians could look at that, even if the US exits the conflict and says, we're not giving you any more money, any more weapons, any more support. We're out of here. We've made a separate deal with Russia. Ukraine could keep fighting, and the Europeans could keep giving them money,
Yeah.
training and weapons. And let's talk about that a little bit. Are the Europeans prepared to do that?
I'm still going to say on balance, my prediction would be no, but it is a less confident no than it
Mm-hmm.
was a few months ago. So you and I were just talking. The European Commission, which is the executive arm of the European Union, looks like it's poised to announce that member countries can increase defense spending without hitting their debt and spending caps under
Mm-hmm.
EU policy. And that seems pretty clearly geared toward one, potentially giving aid to Ukraine in higher volumes, and two, hedging against a
American exit
less
from
less
NATO.
significant American role in Europe and potentially an exit from the alliance.
Yeah, and we've
Yes.
talked about this a little bit. Like the United States maintains upwards of, I don't know, I said 80%. I looked at it later. It's like it's actually upwards of 90% and maybe between like closer to 95% of effective NATO military capability. There's just not a lot of capability there without the United States, which is not to say that there couldn't be, but part of the whole point of NATO has been to underwrite the security of Europe for the entirety of the Cold War and now beyond. So the Europeans haven't needed to spend much, especially after the end of the Cold War for 40 years now. And they haven't. Instead, they've been spending on between the people like to say you got to choose between guns and butter. They're spending on butter, free universal health care and generous unemployment and basically the European social model.
This
Well,
is yeah,
been
this is what
underwritten. Yeah,
skeptics of the alliance that you and I are aware of in the academic sphere refer to this as welfare for the rich.
right.
Uh,
Yeah, if
yeah,
the Europeans had to pay for their own defense, which they really haven't done much of for decades now, then Europe would probably look very different. And I would add like a further step, which is some have argued that the European Union, at least in its current form, wouldn't exist because there'd be a lot of pressure due to, for instance, German rearmament as a result of this. And
yeah. This is now going back much further in history than I think most of what we'll talk about today will be.
yeah,
But
we
yeah,
digress, but this is really interesting
no,
stuff.
I think it's still related, which is like the idea that having the US providing the lion's share of the resources for the defense of the continent takes the hard edge off of relations between countries like Germany and France,
They
which
no
if you
longer threaten each other. They don't have militaries. France still does have independent military capability, but like compared to what it used to be, forget about it.
yeah,
Right.
the best example of that to my mind was when the Obama administration made the bad decision of intervening in Libya in 2011. And part of the reason for that was it turned out that the French and the British just weren't in a position to do it.
Yeah.
And everyone in Washington was like, are you kidding me?
Like, no,
um,
we just don't have the capability anymore.
yeah.
Yeah.
So those capabilities have atrophied. But yeah, I think that was a critical piece. You had to work out that security piece before you could move towards economic integration.
And let alone political integration.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But like reeling it all the way back into this situation, like the Europeans do have a defense establishment. They do have defense contractors, notable ones, especially France, Britain, the Nordics, and Germany.
And
They
they
all
are
have,
relatively wealthy countries.
yeah. So it's not to say that they couldn't jump back into being military powers. And maybe that's about to be what's going to happen, which is interesting.
That's a little, yeah, harder to tell, but I wouldn't rule it out. The only thing I'll say is after for years insisting I don't buy that the Germans are going to rearm, I finally said after the Russian invasion in 2022 that I thought that they would, and they haven't.
They
So
did,
I
yeah.
didn't like abandoning my previously being right. So I'm not totally confident that we'll see that yet. But this is why of all the comments any administration officials made, Hegseth basically saying the US had other strategic priorities, i.e., China, and Europe was somewhat downgraded among US strategic calculations, I found to be the most significant. Not terribly surprising, but in its
No.
implications could be a big deal.
Yeah. Obama has tried to pivot to Asia. Biden has tried to pivot to Asia. Trump tried to pivot to Asia in his first term. Everybody's been trying to pivot to Asia for a really long time. And they always keep getting dragged back into European affairs or Middle Eastern affairs or both. It's always some goddamn thing, right?
Yeah, we'll see. The difference here is I buy that Trump wants to get this done and he's
Yeah.
willing to cut the Ukrainians loose. Now, you
Yep.
asked a little bit about contextualizing this historically, so maybe we
Yeah.
should talk about the end of the Cold War a little bit. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's important. Feel free to chime in since I will definitely forget certain things.
You've forgotten more than I've ever learned. So,
I very much doubt that. There's a few pieces to this. So one of them, which if you're even observing this casually, you've probably heard reference to something called the Budapest Memorandum of
yeah.
1994. There's a few pieces to it. One that I think most people talk about the most is Ukraine was one of three countries after the Cold War, along with Belarus and Kazakhstan, that was born nuclear.
What does that mean?
In other words, Soviet nuclear weapons were stationed there because
Mhm.
those were countries formerly part of the Soviet Union.
And they have a
And
lot of
so,
empty space.
yes. And when those countries, or when the Soviet Union collapsed and they became independent, those weapons were still there. So
Mhm.
part of the deal, which was also negotiated with the United States and the British, was an agreement for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
And one of the things they got in exchange were not security guarantees. In other words, not a full-fledged security alliance like the United States has in NATO or like it has with Japan or South Korea, but negative security assurances. In other words, the United States won't do anything to threaten the sovereign independence of Ukraine. And that was something that Russia agreed to as well.
This is prior to the Putin administration.
Correct. This is under Boris Yeltsin.
Yes, who famously had a team following her around with syringes full of a B vitamin complex when you need to sober up, right?
Oh, see, I thought you were just going to say following him around with alcohol. I didn't know the story.
I think it was both.
Okay,
I think it was both. So they had the one for when you needed to come down and the other for when you needed to perk up and sign a major international treaty and recover nuclear weapons from former Soviet territories.
It's actually a little alarming that that's not the only case of that I'm aware. Like famously during the October 1973 Middle East War, there's a National Security Council meeting where they're debating whether to elevate the level of U.S. military readiness and go upgrade the U.S. nuclear DEFCON status. Should we get President Nixon's write-off here? And someone was like, he's too distraught, i.e. he's hammered. So they just did it without him.
They did.
But I digress again. But the way that agreement, the Budapest Memorandum, I think most people interpret it is essentially Ukraine is going to be a neutral country.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in NATO. It's
not going to be in NATO. Yeah.
It's not part of the Soviet Union. And that interpretation to me makes sense when you look at the larger web of pledges the United States made at the end of the Cold War, one of which, as I interpret the evidence, was pretty clearly not to expand NATO eastward, which of course it has on multiple occasions.
This is interesting and important. And you know much more about this than I do, but I recall reading a number of articles about this that delved into records of the negotiations around this deal. And there were apparently verbal assurances,
Yes.
but no written ones.
No, unless you interpret I forget what it's like, the most obnoxious title for a document, the agreement on reunifying Germany in September 1990.
Okay, so this goes even earlier, really.
Oh, the negotiations most people point to are February 1990, when Secretary of State James Baker told the Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, not 1 inch to the east. Now, it has been claimed that remark was made with reference to U.S. troops within the former East Germany, not. Now, to me, that doesn't make much sense, because if you're Russia or the Soviet Union at the time, okay, if the troops are even closer to your border, that's not very reassuring.
Yeah.
And moreover, it's the German foreign minister at the time was saying these things on that. You can see it on YouTube.
Let's be clear. Poland joined NATO, not relatively soon after that, but I think a decade or two later, right? And Poland is
Were they 99? I think they were 99.
I can't remember, but they're to the east of Germany.
That's
pretty
correct.
clear. The Baltics are also to the east of Germany.
And also formerly part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. And the Baltics are especially tricky, because even at the time, people were like, they're not very defensible by NATO.
It raises similar questions of nuclear strategy to ones you're obviously aware of, like, how did you defend West Berlin during the Cold War, which was hundreds of miles each side of East German territory? No offense to Estonians, Latvians, or Lithuanians, but the military punch they're packing for NATO is just not all that significant, and they're very exposed to Russian power, and so it creates a real deterrence dilemma.
Yeah, I think I would argue somewhat less so now that Finland and Sweden have joined, but yeah, it's still a big problem.
So to me, it's pretty clear what was promised. Now, there are people who I think take this argument too far. People like you and I have both met John Mearsheimer, who says
JJM.
JJM, the war is the West's fault. To me, that removes any sort of agency from Vladimir Putin and the Russians, and the fact that he has some strange idea. But that said, I think the United States, as it frequently does, had a fairly ridiculous double standard when it came to this. Great powers do not like hostile military alliances on their borders. And if the argument is Ukraine's an independent country, it should be allowed to choose whatever foreign alignment it wants, then the United States almost blowing up the world over Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1962 seems pretty hypocritical to me.
Completely fair. That being said, one could argue that this was caused by changes in Russia's trajectory over time, because earlier in President Vladimir Putin's term, which has lasted a very long time now, I think 25 plus years at this point, 26 years.
About 25, with a weird interregnum where Medvedev was nominally president.
They played musical chairs. He's been in charge for 26 years, pretty much unbroken. Early in his tenure, he did not seem that upset about NATO, and even remarked at one point, maybe Russia can join NATO. And Russia at the time was, I think, interested in rapprochement with the West, was interested in Western investment. And that worked for a while, but Russia always seems to vacillate historically between being Asia facing and European facing, Asia facing, European facing. And this is like one of the central tensions in Russian history. They've squared the circle by developing as a quote unquote Eurasian power, which some interesting documentation emerged, basically laying out what the Russians believe to be their grand strategy, which is to become a fourth power center in the world by reconstituting effectively the Soviet Union as a Eurasian regional bloc to compete with the Chinese, the Americans, and the European Union. Now, say what you will about the realistic prospects of that strategy, and I have plenty to say about it, given their performance in Ukraine and elsewhere recently. But that's what they're going for at this point. But that was not the case 20 years ago.
They were in no position to do that 20
Also
years
true. They were coming out of a period of prostration, total economic collapse and chaos.
Yeah, which by the way, I think there's still widespread resentment toward the US for not only NATO expansion after the Cold War, but also not doing much to aid
Help.
Russia economically at a time when things were disastrous.
Yes, leading to the rise of Putin and
Yeah.
his popularity, in fact, which is real.
Yeah, and there's also a piece of this that just has to do, and this is not unique to Russia, with just kind of resentment of the certain US actions during the unipolar moment. The invasion of Iraq, the Libya operation, which I mentioned earlier, which Russia abstained on and then felt like they got burned because the US overstepped its mandate and went for taking Gaddafi out. So it's a complex picture. I don't know exactly when to date when this becomes as high a priority for Putin. Most people point to, at least among other significant moments, the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, when the declaration is seen by many as the worst of all worlds, because NATO basically said Ukraine and Georgia will eventually be a part of NATO, which is both provocative to the Russians, but also not doing anything to defend those countries.
Or deter Russia, right?
Arguably giving them an incentive to take care of things before they join NATO, which the following month in Georgia, they basically did.
They invaded Georgia and kicked their ass.
And then we come to the key moments in 2013, 2014, where Russia annexes Crimea, starts a frozen conflict in the east of Ukraine. And then for the next few years, to use one journalist's term, treats Ukraine as its petri dish when it comes to cyber operations, doing things like messing with its electrical grid. Famously, in 2017, on Ukraine's Constitution Day, launched a massive cyber attack known as NotPetya, which I believe to this day remains the most destructive one in economic terms.
Yeah, if you have a gaming PC, maybe you ran into that when everything stopped working.
Yeah, that's the context in which all of this has happened. I think you're right. I think Russia has evolved in its foreign policy approach. I think Putin personally has evolved. I think there's a lot of resentment toward the United States, some of which I think is completely, frankly, reasonable. And now we're at this point where I think Putin, for the first time, sees a US president that maybe he can do business with. But this gets back to your point about Trump saying it'll be done in 24 hours. It'll be the most beautiful deal. No one does a deal like I do.
That's good. Real good.
The problem is it's not just up to him, right? This is
Correct.
a 3 or 4-sided negotiation.
That's right. And again, the United States could conclude a deal with Russia and exit. But that is not to say the Ukrainians would stop fighting, and that is not to say that the Europeans would stop supplying them. There's some evidence to suggest that the Ukrainians are sick of fighting, but the evidence is mixed.
Or at least ambiguous, right?
Yes.
So like Gallup did a poll soon after Trump won re-election that showed a very slight majority of Ukrainians preferred ending the war as soon as possible, and something like 40% said keep fighting till victory. But there was nothing in the wording of those questions when it came to what the outline of a settlement would look like, which obviously would shape those figures.
Yeah. If you were like, you're going to lose 20% of your territory and be demilitarized, you're never going to join NATO, and you're going to be effectively a vassal state of Russia, unless, you're prepared to fight more in 5 years. I would imagine that 52% would go down.
I imagine it would go down substantially.
Yeah. And that's the worry. If we get a peace deal now with Ukraine kind of suffering as a result of the deal, Ukraine will only get weaker and Russia will only get stronger, is the theory. Now, I have some questions about that theory, because in terms of what Russia has actually accomplished with the Ukraine war,
it's been a disaster.
Unmitigated disaster. They've lost, I don't know, we've estimated 200,000 to 250,000 killed, another 750,000 wounded, or maybe a little bit less than that, 600,000, somewhere in there. These are unclear numbers. Only the Russians know for sure, and maybe they don't even know. They've burned through massive amounts of material, tens of thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, tens of thousands of drones, artillery, anti-aircraft. They've depleted this massive stockpile of weapons that they inherited from the Soviet Union, the world's largest stockpile of conventional material, to the point where they've had to go hat in hand to North Koreans.
And to the Iranians for
and
drones.
to the Iranians, yeah, which is like not great. It's embarrassing, but it's worked.
Doing things like selling oil at massive discounts to China.
Mm-hmm. And potentially nuclear secrets as well to the Iranians and North Koreans who are interested in that. It's like things have not gone well. Yeah, they've not gone well. And now you look at what's happening to Russia economically. In terms of the quote unquote prize they've won in the 20% of Ukraine that they've picked up as a result of this, 50% of the people left. And the economy in those areas has shrunk by 80%. So it's not exactly a big prize jewel. It's actually a destroyed wasteland filled with extremely resentful people.
Yeah. Now, like, by the way, this is my retort to people that view this war as absolutely critical when it comes to U.S. national interests. Like, we can debate how critical and things like morality and stuff like that if we want to. People are like, if you don't hold the line on Ukraine, next it's going to be Poland, then it's going to be Germany. It's one, as we were just saying, Ukraine's not in NATO.
Yep.
And two, yes, in part this is because of U.S. support, but like the Russians can't even get to Kyiv. I'm not really worried about them getting to the English Channel.
They got to Kyiv and got their ass handed to them and then left.
Correct.
So, yeah, they were unprepared, as it turns out. And look, I want to be clear. They have a lot of capability. They have a battle-hardened army that is extremely dangerous. They have nuclear weapons. Like, they're not to be trifled with. But in terms of like when the chips are down, they can't even beat the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have had a lot of help, but it's not clear to me that even without as much help, the Ukrainians will be a walkover for the Russians. They won't be.
Yeah. I also, by the way, like they face a lot of the same problems that the Soviet Union did toward the end of the Cold War. They are not an economic power at this point. They're
going backwards economically. We can talk about that a little bit. Inflation is now running 10% in Russia. Interest rates are at 21%. We think things are bad in the United States when interest rates are at like 4% and inflation is at 6%. That was enough to lose the election.
I was about to
Biden
say,
and Harris.
In fact, that is why Donald Trump is president more than any other, I would argue.
Yes, that was the main factor. And it's okay, Russia's not a democracy, but even autocracies have a so-called quote unquote selectorate. Was that Bruce Bueno de Mesquita? I think it was.
That sounds right. And maybe there's some co-authors in there, but
there are powerful people and interest groups that he needs to maintain the support of. And public opinion is not irrelevant. The dude, Putin's chef, 18 months ago, what was his name?
Prigozhin.
Yeah. That was short-lived, but it's indicative of the kind of thing that can happen. And he depends on a close circle of powerful people around him to keep him in power. And
so, I mean, this is where like the bargain, and I want to hear your thoughts on it. The bargaining gets interesting because if, to use the term that we in the business use, the balance of resolve, basically who gives a shit the most?
Yeah.
You could argue it's the Ukrainians.
I would argue it's the Ukrainians.
It's their territory, their security. The future is very much impacts them. The most. Then potentially the Russians, and especially Putin personally, as we were just saying. I would argue, I think your phrasing is right. I think this has been an unmitigated disaster for him. I do not buy the argument that if he comes out of this having lopped off the Donbass, it just hasn't been worth it in blood and treasure.
It hasn't, because the Donbass is now an albatross. It's a dead albatross.
Even if it weren't, the expenditure in resources that has already gone, I don't think Russia is going to be in a position to make major threats. after
Not,
this war ends for the foreseeable future.
yeah. And in fact, you look at some of the information that's emerged about Russian doctrine and strategic thinking about what comes after this. We're going to have to rearm and get ready for another confrontation. That will take 5 to 10 years. And
Correct.
yeah, 5 to 10 years down the road, Europe will be a lot more ready for whatever the Russians are going to do. Who
Well, so
knows what the United States will be doing at that point?
I would argue the Europeans then are probably third. It's their continent. And I would argue the US is fourth. I think Trump doesn't really care all that much.
He doesn't. And he's been quoted as saying, we have a big, beautiful ocean in between us and them. And that
Is
really
that what he said?
I don't know if he's read The Tragedy of Great Power Politics by John J. Mearsheimer, but like a big part of that theory is the stopping power of water.
Yeah, which he took from Otto von Bismarck.
Sure. Yeah, and Mackinder and everybody else, right? Yeah.
The Bismarck quote is, God favors fools, drunkards, and the United States of America, or something like that. But where that leaves us is if the Ukrainians are one in the balance of resolve, one could argue they are four in terms of capabilities, if left to themselves.
Yes.
I honestly don't know how I would rate the Russians versus the whole. Like, if it's the whole of Europe and they're actually doing real rearmament, I would put the Europeans ahead of the Russians. But I'm not convinced that's going to happen.
Russia's economy is the size of Spain. And Spain is actually doing really well economically, and it's much bigger than it used to be as an economic power. But like Russia's economy, like on a per capita basis, Russia has about 3 times more people than Spain. Right.
And obviously much more massive land mass and access to resources and things like that. But yeah, I think the Russian economy is what, like $2.5 trillion?
I couldn't tell you offhand, but it's not commensurate with the number of people they have or the size of its territory.
I'm going to look it up right now.
So you look at that and you're like, if Spain felt like spending
about 2.2 trillion, by the way.
2.2 trillion. And Russia is now spending, I don't know, it's hard to get a good percentage figure in terms of what it's spending on its military, in terms of its total GDP, but it's got to be into the double-digit percentages now.
Which, to put that in context, US, a big year is like 5% spending.
That's like a really big year. Yeah.
And that's for a US economy, which is much larger than Russia's economy.
That's right. Yeah. Like 20 times larger. Maybe not that much, but yeah.
Roughly.
Yeah. It's really much bigger. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like Russia can continue to double down and it can continue to expand the amount of military spending that it sinks into this confrontation with the West and with Europe. But it's like the costs of that add up over time. It can attempt to restore the Soviet Union, which was effectively, a military that had a Politburo attached to it. And that was about it. And then a bunch of slave laborers. Like, that's the extreme that Russia is coming from. And I don't think anybody in Russia necessarily wants to go back there, but they're like heading back there as a result of this slowly. And it still wouldn't be enough. I don't think they can restore the Soviet Union. And in fact, while they've had their eye off the ball, spending money, blood, and treasure in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Central Asian states have all basically drifted further away from Russia and asserted their independence. So that's just going to get harder.
Yeah, I don't see any world where that happens. Actually, here's a question for you. If you're China, do you want this war to keep going?
I don't think so, especially not if the United States is no longer involved. Because I think China was mostly interested in supporting the Russians because it kept the Biden administration occupied.
Yeah.
And it kept us spending money there. I think as soon as Trump exits, and we're not paying attention to this anymore, we need to pay attention to China. This no longer matters to the Chinese.
So I agree with that. I would have said the same thing. I also agree with if it turns out, because you never know with Trump. Like, he might wake up one morning and be like, screw it. Like, we're doing it. We're doing 50% of our GDP to Ukraine. Like, you just never know with the guy.
You never know.
It's very unlikely, but I do think if the US is tying down large number of resources in Eastern Europe, this is why I didn't really buy the whole linkage to Taiwan arguments. Those arguments always struck me as the same way the United States got bogged down in Vietnam.
Right. It's this idea that the domino theory and linkage of credibility between
Yeah,
conflicts, right?
which
And
I would rather have those resources free for the Western Pacific if you believe that's where the real zone of competition lies in the
that's the
first
counter
century.
argument. Yeah. It's like credibility depends on two factors. One is material capability, and the other is resolve, right? So you can demonstrate more resolve maybe by fighting everywhere at the same time, but you're not going to have the same capability.
Correct.
So it's you look at that multiplication problem, and it evens out to the same thing or actually worse.
But the only other piece of this I would say is I I also think the whole China Russia the partnership without end or whatever they're called.
Yes. Yeah, the
Um,
like Putin and Chairman Xi Jinping are broskies, right?
yeah,
Big
like
time broskies.
I don't know how much like she wakes up in the morning and is we got the Russians with us. I'm just like
No,
I'm
they
just not
they're so
so
Russia is a gigantic mining concern as far as Xi Jinping is concerned. He wants the minerals, he wants the energy resources, and that's about it. He wants them dependent, which they are.
but I guess to the extent that if Trump negotiates a deal that helps reverse what is now a multi-decade long trend in deteriorating US Russian relations, and that
Yes.
helps split Russia and China somewhat. But
Yes.
I generally agree with you that if you're the Chinese, especially if the US is not involved in this, you'd probably prefer the war to end.
Yeah. And interestingly, one thing that could happen, I don't think it necessarily will, but it could happen should the United States exit this confrontation with Russia, is a replay of the Sino Soviet split the other way around. Like Nixon went to China famously in the 70s and opened up China. And then we got Chairman Deng and all of that, the liberalization of China and the accession to WTO and the outsourcing of American manufacturing capacity. And it's interesting how history rhymes. Now, Trump, as arguably a result of that echo of that process, is coming in and maybe could conceivably, I don't know that he sees it this way or cares, could actually affect a reconciliation between the United States and Russia and turn Russia against the Chinese because let's face it, Russia and China are natural enemies. And they
Correct.
have been for most of history. They share a gigantic border.
China seems pretty interested in large
Siberia.
chunks of Eastern Russia now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, Russia is in demographic decline. There are fewer Russians all the time. Like it's not really growing that fast. Plenty of Chinese. China is also in demographic decline, but there's way more Chinese than Russians, about 10 times more. And Siberia is now largely ethnic Chinese, like large parts of Siberia. So at some point in the future, as the world continues to thaw and Siberia becomes more valuable, you could actually see confrontation similar to what has happened between Russia and Ukraine happen in Siberia between China and Russia. We need to protect our nationals, right?
Yeah, the key takeaway you said there was they're natural enemies, which
Yes.
by the can I just go on a quick rant on
Yeah.
this?
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
Like,
let us have it.
yeah, this was, I don't know, almost 10 years ago now. Like Netflix came out with that documentary on Henry Kissinger.
Mm.
You've read his memoirs too. He really plays up the degree to which the Nixon administration discovered that there were Sino-Soviet tensions. Like he uses the word detected, I think, in it, and makes it yeah, all of this has been out in the open press for like well over a decade, and people hold this up as, oh my God, he figured out that China and the Soviet Union weren't getting along well. Yeah,
Yeah.
all
Or you
you
could
had to do
just
was
look
pick
at
up a
history.
newspaper. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Look at the Boxer Rebellion or the Opium Wars or any of it.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that there is a potential play there for Trump, whether he is interested in taking it or not. But I'm interested in light of all of that. Like, if you were Volodymyr Zelensky,
Yeah.
what's your bottom line for a deal, assuming the days in which the US is going to be backing you substantially are numbered?
Yeah, in order for me to stop fighting, what do I need from the Russians? Is
Yeah.
what you're asking in particular.
Like, what does the deal have to look like?
This is really interesting because if I am Zelensky, I do not trust anything the Russians say. And I think he said this. It's not actually really up to the Russians. The Russians need to stop fighting.
You can't blame him for thinking that.
I can't. Yeah. And so it's really much like his position is Ukraine will continue to fight pretty much no matter what. Now, there are some conditions where Russia stops where it is or returns to the 2014 borders. I think that generates a halt in direct hostilities, but it certainly doesn't generate like a pause in rearmament or preparedness, because I don't think that'll ever happen again. Somebody has, I forget who, I read an article maybe a year or two ago. Ukraine's future is as the Israel of Europe, basically. So basically an armed camp with basically the finest military in Europe, probably. And arguably they already have that. It's very tired, it's exhausted, but in terms of capability, it's tremendously capable.
So is that, so I've heard the same comparison, right? Is Israel like Taiwan is another one? Mm-hmm. Is that like a pseudo alliance space? Is that like a security guarantee by another name? Is the deal, because according to Trump, and I thought this was unlikely, as did you, as did most analysts, that as part of the deal, the Russians would be okay with Ukraine joining NATO. So it seems like that's out.
At least for now, yeah.
I find it hard to believe it'll happen, but I guess we'll see. But then there has to be some sort of enforcement mechanism. And if it's going to be an Israel type relationship with the United States, one, you have to assume that this White House is willing to do that.
So I don't think it's going to be with the United States.
You think it'll be with the Europeans?
I think it will be with the Europeans or some subset of the Europeans. It may not be with NATO because NATO includes Turkey, Hungary, right. I believe. These are countries that are not necessarily fully simpatico with the Russians, especially Turkey. But Hungary all by itself can stop a security guarantee from NATO, annoyingly. And Viktor Orban is one of Putin's mouthpieces in Europe.
He's one of J.D. Vance's mouthpieces too.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, he's big in the new GOP.
By the way, like this just happened, Vance's speech being like, you need to be more welcoming of the far right parties, like essentially, and with the Germans AFD, basically backing Elon Musk's arguments that the AFD needs to be welcomed. I'm like, what a world in contrast to what is known as the greatest generation in the United States.
Yeah, this is the capitulation generation, right? The worm turns. The worm has turned. And yeah, no, I think Eastern Europe, basically all by itself, can and probably will underwrite Ukrainian defense. Along with the Ukrainians themselves, they have a substantial defense industry. And by some measures, they're now producing 40% of their own material. That number will only go up. They're innovators, in automated warfare and drone warfare, among the best in the world.
At a certain point, though, it's not yes, it is a large country, actually, if you look at a map, but like
very large.
There's a question as to how many resources it can continue to dedicate to military and defense spending over a long period.
Yeah, I don't think they necessarily want to continue to spend 50% of its GDP on military or 25% or wherever they're at this point. They've been in extremis. They've had to dig really deep just to survive. So they do need a pause, and they are interested in a pause. But I don't think it's ever going to be the case that they rely purely on diplomacy for their security. I think they're going to turn into an armed camp, and the Europeans are going to help them.
So let's say it's something like the Russians sign a piece of paper reiterating the assurances that we will respect Ukraine's sovereign and territorial
what
integrity.
Remains of it. This time we mean it, guys.
Yeah, Ukraine is not in NATO. For all we know, by the way, we'll probably do an episode at some point. Who knows what happens to NATO? Because I take the Trump stuff on NATO pretty seriously.
That's interesting. He hasn't, so neither he nor Hegseth nor Vance, really, neither Trump nor his sock puppets have said that America is done with NATO.
Yeah.
What they have said is the Europeans need to spend way more on defense. I think the figure quoted by Hegseth was 5%, which, if you think about it, actually makes some sense given the deficit that the Europeans are dealing with and their need to like really rearm if the United States isn't going to be there as much. And so the way Hegseth has couched this is as an acknowledgement of reality. And I think there's something to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, we'll have to, and he might not want to overload the circuit right now. Look, I don't know. I don't pretend to understand based on what he said in his first term, some of the moves he's made. I wouldn't be surprised, but it seems like in any case, Ukraine's not going to be a part of NATO. So
it could be a part of the EU.
Potentially, which is odd.
It is odd, but like this whole thing arguably kicked off in 2014 because there was a pro-European revolution.
Correct.
In Ukraine, getting rid of basically Putin's man in Ukraine, who's now still in exile in Russia. And I'm forgetting his name.
Viktor Yanukovych.
Yanukovych, thank you. Yeah. The Euromaidan revolution, right? That is when the little green men started showing up in the Donbass, famously. Russian soldiers in like plain uniforms, right? Plain clothes, basically. So we don't know who these guys are. They must be indigenous Russians.
And that basically, as you said, seemed to be due primarily to the overthrow of Yanukovych, who was replaced by Petro Poroshenko, who seemed much more willing to orient Ukraine westward and wanted to join the EU and things like that. So it would be odd if this ended with Ukrainian EU membership.
I think it would be natural. I think that they've actually started the accession process, and who knows how long that will take. It can take decades. But
or in Turkey's case, never.
Yeah, and the Turkey's leader famously remarked, "If you're just going to be a Christian club, why didn't you say so?" You're pretty salty, and I get it.
Look, I'm not a fan of his, but he wasn't wrong.
He's not wrong. Yeah. It turns out that the Europeans' universal values break down at a certain point, don't they?
Are pretty particularistic.
Yeah. A little bit selective. Anyway, yeah. So it wouldn't surprise me if, as a result of this, like one piece of this is Ukrainian membership in the EU gets accelerated.
Okay, so let's say I give you that. So you get to be in the EU, you're not in NATO. You get some sort of, whether they are bilateral with other European states or a multilateral defense assurances.
I think it's multilateral. I think it's
multilateral, like we will keep you armed the way the United States does things with Taiwan, but not security guarantees. And Russia maintains all the territory it currently occupies. Is that a deal that you would take if you're Zelensky?
I think it's the best deal you're going to get.
I agree.
Yeah. And again, the deal isn't with Russia, right? This is a really interesting aspect of this. You're not even going through intermediaries. What you're doing is you are restoring homeostasis in the relationship by getting more support from a different party. And then, yes, like Ukraine and Russia may interface directly. They may sign a piece of paper, but there will be no trust on either side. That's very clear to me. It's going to be balance of power, purely.
The other side of this, in some ways, I find more interesting because, look, I think if you asked either one of us, given everything we just said about how disastrous this has been for Russia, if you offered me the deal of, okay, you get Russia's keeping the territory it has occupied both since 2022 and since 2014 and gets to keep the Crimean Peninsula. And in exchange for that, you have to give Ukraine paper assurances that essentially reiterate the Budapest Memorandum assurances that you violated. And the US lifts all of its sanctions and we try to normalize relations. I think he should take that deal in a heartbeat.
I would too.
Declare victory and
go home.
Try to sell it to everyone. I'm not sure that he does. And that to me is the interesting piece.
Yeah. So Putin has become increasingly idiosyncratic over time. And you could, I think, reasonably argue that this whole idea of invading Ukraine is highly idiosyncratic and made no sense even when it started, let alone continuing it, right? It's yes, they are making forward progress. Yes, they are taking more territory, but to what end?
And at what
Strategically.
cost?
And at what cost? Yeah, strategically, it's a net loss. It's a deadweight loss.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that he's going to stop though, because he doesn't seem to be rational anymore. To your point.
Yeah, it's always hard to talk rationality in international relations.
Yeah.
I think the Russians have legitimate beef, particularly with the United States, over how it has approached Eastern Europe over the last 3.5 decades.
Yeah.
So I don't want to downplay that because I see vanishing little discussion of it in American political context.
Except from John Mearsheimer. But yeah.
Yeah, but then he goes,
too far.
yeah,
and in the wrong venues.
It's like Lewis Black's take on American politics. Like one party's, I have a terrible idea, and the other party's, I have just as shitty an idea completely in the other direction.
What's in the middle, guys?
I think that context is important. But yeah, like I don't look at that guy as a reassuring person to have on the international stage at the moment. And I'm not sure where he's at. I'm not sure that one thing we didn't say is they were able to lessen the impact on Russian society, or at least among ethnic Russians, by doing things like recruiting non-ethnic Russians from within his borders to as conscripts, trying to do things with the central bank to lighten the blow on Russians. I don't think that's a sustainable strategy over the long term, but I also think he might look at Trump now and say that guy is clearly interested in getting this over with, regardless of what Vance said. And so maybe this is the time to push forward what some people refer to as the victory disease. Like, I'm not convinced he would take the deal you and I just discussed, even if you and I think he would be dumb not to.
Yeah, so let's play that out a little bit. What happens if he doesn't take the deal? And does the United States continue with sanctions at a minimum? Doesn't really cost the United States much of anything, right? Maybe they stop sending military aid.
I think Trump lifts the sanctions too.
Okay, so he just exits.
Yeah.
And this is not diplomacy, again, so much as it is power politics. So irregardless of what Putin does, he is signaling basically, we are done with this conflict. We will not enforce sanctions. We will not fund the Ukrainians. We will not underwrite their participation in NATO. We're gone.
He's basically then handing it to the Europeans. Hey, this is now your problem.
Yes, and I think that they will take it. I think they will take that problem and they will get on the ball, and it will take some time and it'll be a little bit hairy for sure. But I think the Ukrainians have already done enough to buy time and slow down the Russians and fight them basically to a standstill. I think the Europeans can sub in for the United States, and they will. And I don't think Putin will get that much further.
And you think they will as a function of their own concerns about the threat Russia poses to them, or does it have more to do with norms of international behavior and things
I think
like
the
that?
Europeans still believe in norms of international behavior and international law, number one. The United States no longer does under the Trump administration.
I would argue it hasn't for a long time. That
sure, yeah, the lip service argument, which we've talked about. So that's part of it, but I think it's the primary factor is power politics, it's geopolitics, and even if it's not the entirety of European NATO or the entirety of the EU, there's a lot of potential power there, and I think that there's a recognizance that Europe is in a bad deficit militarily, and that needs to turn around in a real way, and there will be political will to do it. I believe all of that. And there's one of two ways this can go. One way is all of these pro-Russia populist parties take over in these countries and basically capitulate I actually think this will result in the opposite outcome, which is people will look askance at what they're saying once the United States exits. There will be a counter pressure within these countries domestically and a restoration of anti-Russian sentiment.
I think we've already seen that.
Yeah. So this idea that the alternative for Deutschland is naturally going to take over Germany, German democracy, I don't see it happening. I actually see the opposite.
I think they're only the third biggest party, right? Like I don't think
Yeah,
they've ever.
everybody's worried because they've been growing, but it may be that they hit their natural ceiling electorally in terms of support already, and they've started to recede. And I think that, again, it's first order, second order effects, or the reversal of the second image, whereby international pressure affects domestic politics and generates counter pressure, right? So Germans at large, German voters, are not going to want to see the Russians on the march, obviously. Like one thing to be pro-Russian in a distant conflict. The closer that conflict comes, you get counter pressure.
I also think they're primarily strong in the East.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how popular they are in the West of the country.
Not.
But we should also say it's not like it's just Germany, right?
No.
There's
First,
far right
France.
movements. France, Marine Le Pen, Hungary, we've already mentioned. Poland has had
Yeah.
a far right
With Law and
restriction.
Justice. Obviously, Meloni is far right in Italy, but interestingly, she's been very pro-Ukraine. So you can take that and be like, these are nationalist parties.
Yeah.
And what that means is not a capitulation to Russia. It means a promotion of Italian national interest.
So that's right. I would take this full circle though to where we start, and this is why I emphasize that Hegseth quote. Look, we will see, as you said, the pivot to Asia has proven to be like not a pivot.
Yeah.
Like it keeps being like this is the year it's going to happen, and I'm not saying there has been no reallocation of resources toward that theater. I think there has been, but as you said, much like my career, it keeps getting sucked back into the Middle East. And then after the invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe also became a major theater. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm not saying that there's no possibility that continues to happen, but I do think this administration seems to take that idea very seriously and certainly wants this to be over with. And if that happens, and this ends up being not just a Ukraine question, and in some ways it already is not, it's a Europe security-wide question, particularly if the United States alters its approach toward NATO more fundamentally. Like, European politics is going to look very different than it has in about 8 decades.
You're right.
And it's anyone's guess what happens at that point. It might not be the most peaceful system if you buy, again, people like John Mearsheimer, who thinks if you were to remove American power from the region, all of these old national rival, right? Now everyone has to provide for their own security. I think we've briefly alluded to the possibility of a German nuclear capability and what that would do to Russian concern. Like, it opens up a whole bunch of questions, and things might look very interesting at that point. Now, there's another perspective. Hey, the Europeans have done a really good job of integrating economically.
The Schengen area, right?
To some extent politically, and so maybe those days are older and the so-called German problem has already been solved. But if nothing else, all those questions are back on the table in a way that they haven't been in a very long time.
I wrote my dissertation on this, actually, and I developed computer models looking directly at the question of internal versus external pressure in the process of state formation.
I remember that.
Yeah. So this is the crux of the matter, right? It's this idea of whether internal pressure is like whether external pressure is enough to overcome internal pressure, and whether Russia presents a large enough threat over a long enough period of time. We know that Putin is interested in breaking up the European Union and NATO. That's been a policy of his for a number of decades now. First clandestine, and now completely out in the open. That's why he's so supportive of Orban and these right-wing parties. in European democracies.
I might say be careful what you wish for, by the
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. My argument is we've seen this play out in history, and it's usually not the case that the aggressor is able to pull apart like a nascent state, like what you could call Europe, right? I think the European Union has existed for long enough now that there's some notion of Europeanness, European culture, especially with people moving all over the place within Schengen and conducting business. There's enough there where they will want to protect it. But this remains to be seen.
That remains to be seen. And
Yeah.
as we might have said before, the famous quote on NATO was, yes, it keeps the Soviets out. It also keeps the Americans in and the Germans down.
Yeah, exactly.
And if the Americans are not in, keeping the Germans down and the Russians out becomes a very different equation to solve.
True, but like we've seen in the past, if we talk about continental European history, military history, right? The three big players are generally France, Germany, and Russia, with the UK playing an offshore balancing role. And there are different combinations of those.
Yeah.
Over time. And sometimes it's France and Germany against Russia.
Sometimes it's a world war.
Yeah. In fact, very often in the 20th century. So, yeah, these are good points. I don't know, but this is going to play out over the next couple of decades, I think.
So my last question for you, like, how do you think the American public thinks about this? My sense is that people don't care all that much.
I think that's right. I think like the base case for the American public's opinion of foreign affairs in general is they don't care very much. That's just classically true of the American electorate. I think that changes when the United States gets directly attacked.
Correct. I also think with this particular conflict, and I guess more broadly, just the time we're living through, there's so much political polarization that it became a politicized cause. And there was a weird reversal among the parties.
I mentioned earlier that Russia is actually, and Putin are pretty popular among the American right wing and the GOP, which was very much not the case prior to the Trump era. But
ditto for the FBI.
Yeah, I remember reading a quote yeah, exactly. At some point in Trump's first term being like, Putin could win the governorship of any southern state, like easily.
That true?
Think about it. Think about what he stands for. It's like traditional values, Christianity, or what he purports to stand for, right? Russia for Russians and so on.
Yeah. What a time to be alive.
Yeah. As I said, like things change over time.
I only ask because I agree with your assessment in general. I don't think Americans are even aware of foreign policy.
Yeah, largely.
What that means is Trump has a lot of room for maneuver. I don't think there will be any pushback from Congress because his party controls it and his party is him at this point.
Yes.
And even among Democrats, I'm not sure. There was that interesting moment a couple of years ago when like the Progressive Caucus was aligned with people on the right that were more skeptical of the war. Like, I think that part of the party still is not enthusiastic about the war effort.
Yeah.
So I think you'll see very little pushback in the United States if Trump tries to cut the Ukrainians loose, even if it's not a very good deal for them.
Or no deal, which is what we were discussing. I'm done with you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. I still think that there will be some degree of involvement. I don't expect just a complete unilateral withdrawal, but like what the contours of that involvement are, it might be close to unilateral withdrawal and disarmament.
Yeah. I don't think he thinks the political stakes for the United States are all that high.
Yeah. And he's not necessarily wrong about that.
No, I agree with that, actually.
Yeah, other than defending so-called universal values, which he really manifestly doesn't care about.
Yeah, but this is another thing, and I don't like being in this position where because I'm not a Trump guy.
Really?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. But like, the people making that argument need to look in the mirror. One could argue there has been that the United States has been the biggest violator of the so-called liberal world order since the end of the Cold War, if you look
Yes.
at its various interventions. So I don't
Yes.
have a lot of patience for that argument.
Yeah. And the Russians and the Chinese make this argument too. And just because they're our enemies doesn't mean that they're wrong necessarily. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Shall we leave it there?
I think so.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, Galen.
Thank you, Steve. Another one in
Yep.
the books.
Another one in the books. Global Tantrum, everybody. Till next time.
Till next time.